In early September of 1859, a clerk at the St. James Parish Record Office received a request that he would remember for the rest of his career. The man, whose name was Arthur Blanchard, was 57 years old and had worked in that office since the age of 19. He had seen wills contested, deeds challenged, and more than a few families attempt to adjust the official record to their advantage. But nobody had ever walked through the door and asked with perfect politeness to remove specific pages from an estate inventory before it was formally registered. The request came from a representative of the Blackwood family. The patriarch, Silas Blackwood, had died 8 weeks earlier on the 14th of July, 1859. The cause of death, according to the parish register, was a fever that had taken him in the space of 4 days. He was 60 years old. His estate was substantial, over 2,000 acres along the Mississippi River, including sugarcane fields, a sugar mill, a dock used for river transport, livestock, equipment, several smaller parcels of land across St. James Parish, and the main residence known simply as the Blackwood House. The inventory of his possessions ran to 31 handwritten pages, and Arthur Blanchard had been preparing it for final registration when the family's agent appeared. The agent, a man named Mr. Corbin, who worked as a legal assistant for the family's attorney in New Orleans, explained that the Blackwoods had identified certain errors in the inventory. Nothing major, he assured Arthur. A few pages that needed to be replaced with corrected versions. The adjustments concerned some old debts and the valuation of certain parcels of land. Mr. Corbin spoke with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him, and he seemed genuinely surprised when Arthur refused. Arthur Blanchard was not a courageous man by nature, but he was meticulous. He explained that once an inventory was submitted for registration, alterations required judicial authorization. He could not simply remove pages. Mr. Corbin's expression shifted. He asked if an exception might be made. Arthur said it could not. That was the law, and he had spent 38 years following it. Mr. Corbin left. 2 days later, on the morning of the 8th of September, 2 men from the Blackwood family arrived in person. They did not introduce themselves, but Arthur later identified them from descriptions provided by others. They were Edmund Blackwood, the younger brother of the deceased Silas, and Nathaniel Blackwood, a cousin who managed the family's commercial accounts. The men were polite, even cordial. They asked to review the inventory one final time before registration, and Arthur, seeing no legal obstacle, allowed them to examine the documents in a side room. Half an hour later, they emerged, thanked him, and left. It was only after they had gone that Arthur realized all 31 pages of the inventory were missing. The men had simply collected every sheet and walked out. When Arthur sent a messenger to the Blackwood property later that day demanding the return of the documents, the reply was that a clerk would deliver the corrected pages within the week. The reply also noted, almost as an afterthought, that the family was eager to avoid any unnecessary delays in the settlement of Silas Blackwood's affairs. Arthur Blanchard had been in that room alone with the inventory for several hours before the men arrived. He had read every page, and there was one detail that had puzzled him, a detail he could not stop thinking about after the documents disappeared. Throughout the inventory, scattered among the listings of land parcels, farming equipment, promissory notes and household goods, there was a recurring entry for something called the North House. The name appeared 4 times. First, as a building described as a small residential structure located on the northern boundary of the property. Second, in a maintenance ledger that showed monthly payments for upkeep stretching back 18 years and 7 months. Third, in a list of household expenses that included food, clothing, and medical supplies. Fourth, in a separate accounting of wages paid to 2 employees assigned exclusively to that location. The North House. Arthur had worked in St. James Parish for almost 4 decades, and he knew the geography of every major property in the county. He had surveyed land records, tax maps, and succession documents going back to the 1830s. He had never seen a building called the North House on any map of the Blackwood estate. He had never heard anyone mention it. By all official records, it did not exist. And yet, according to the inventory submitted by the family itself, the Blackwoods had been paying for its maintenance every month for nearly 20 years. The Blackwood property occupied a long, narrow strip of land running west from the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, roughly 12 miles south of the town of Convent. The estate had been established in 1801 by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who had arrived in Louisiana from South Carolina with enough capital to purchase undeveloped riverfront land and enough slaves to clear it. By the time of his death in 1827, Jeremiah had transformed the property into one of the most productive sugar plantations in St. James Parish. His son, Isaac Blackwood, expanded the holdings further, adding a sugar mill in 1832 and a private dock for loading barrels onto river barges. When Isaac died in 1841, the estate passed to his 3 children, Silas, the eldest, then Edmund, and finally Eleanor. Publicly, the Blackwoods of the 1850s were known as respectable merchants and landowners. They produced sugar, yes, but they also operated a small fleet of flatboats that transported goods between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. They attended church regularly at St. Michael's in Convent. They contributed to local charities. They hosted dinners for planters and politicians. They were, by all outward measures, a family of standing and substance. But there were tensions beneath the surface, as there always are. Silas Blackwood had married Margaret Duval in 1835. The marriage produced no children, which was a source of quiet but persistent disappointment. Edmund, the younger brother, had never married at all. He lived in a separate wing of the main house and devoted himself to the management of the fields and the mill. Nathaniel Blackwood, a cousin from a cadet branch of the family who had come to Louisiana in the 1830s after some unspecified trouble in Charleston, handled the accounts and the commercial correspondence. The household was completed by a rotating cast of overseers, house servants, field workers, cooks, and a governess who had been retained years earlier for children who never arrived. The death of Silas Blackwood in July of 1859 destabilized this arrangement. Under the terms of his will, drawn up in 1853, control of the estate passed to Edmund as executor and primary heir. Margaret, the widow, was granted a life interest in the main house and an annual allowance of $2,000. Nathaniel retained his position managing the accounts. The will made no mention of Eleanor Blackwood, which at the time seemed unremarkable. Everyone knew that Eleanor had left Louisiana years earlier. Everyone knew she had renounced her claim to the family property. Everyone knew she was not part of the story. The problem began when the creditors arrived. Silas Blackwood had borrowed heavily in the final years of his life. The sugar market had been volatile throughout the 1850s, and the family had taken out a series of loans from banks and private lenders in New Orleans, using portions of the estate as collateral. The total indebtedness, according to preliminary estimates, exceeded $40,000, a considerable sum in 1859. The creditors naturally wanted their money, and they wanted to be certain that the estate's assets were what the Blackwoods claimed they were. In late September, a consortium of New Orleans lenders hired a man named Thomas Hale to review the Blackwood accounts. Thomas was 36 years old, a native of Massachusetts, who had moved south a decade earlier to work as a bookkeeper for a cotton brokerage. He was competent, methodical, and, most importantly for the creditors, he had no connections to the planter class of Louisiana. He could not be pressured by family names or social obligations. He was a numbers man, and he arrived at the Blackwood property on the 2nd of October, 1859, carrying a leather satchel filled with blank ledgers, a bottle of ink, and a letter of authorization signed by 3 of the largest creditors. The main house, when Thomas first saw it, was impressive in the way that old Louisiana plantation houses often were. 2 stories of white-painted brick, with tall columns supporting a second-floor gallery surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. But the impression faded on closer inspection. The paint was peeling in places. The roof showed signs of recent patching. The gardens, once formal, had grown wild at the edges. It was a house that looked like it had been waiting for something for a long time. Thomas was received by Margaret Blackwood, the widow. She was, by his later account, gracious but guarded, a woman in her late 40s who wore black mourning clothes with the air of someone who had been preparing for widowhood for years. She offered him tea, showed him to the small study where he would work, and assured him that the family's records were entirely in order. Edmund Blackwood, who appeared later that afternoon, was less welcoming. He was a tall man with a hard face, and the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller. He told Thomas, without preamble, that the estate's finances were a private family matter, and that the creditors were being unnecessarily aggressive. Thomas replied politely that he was only there to review the books. He was not an investigator. He was an accountant. The books were kept in a windowless room on the ground floor of the main house, a space that had apparently served as Silas Blackwood's private office. The room contained a large oak desk, several cabinets filled with ledgers and correspondence, and an iron safe that Thomas was told contained the most important documents. The safe was unlocked for him on the 3rd day of his visit, after Margaret had located the key in a drawer of her late husband's dressing room. Thomas began his work on the morning of the 4th of October. By the evening of the 7th of October, he had identified an anomaly. The anomaly appeared in the household expense ledgers, a series of heavy leather-bound volumes that covered the years from 1837 to the present. Starting in February of 1841, the ledgers showed a small monthly withdrawal, usually between $15 and $20, directed to a person identified only as Eleanor B. The withdrawals appeared every month without exception for 18 years and 8 months. They were recorded in the same handwriting as the rest of the entries, which Thomas recognized as Nathaniel Blackwood's. The amounts varied slightly from month to month, but they never stopped. When Silas Blackwood fell ill in June of 1859, the withdrawal for that month was still made. When he died in July, the withdrawal for July was made. The withdrawal for August was made. The withdrawal for September was made. Thomas was thorough. He checked the employee payroll records. No Eleanor. He checked the list of creditors and suppliers. No Eleanor. He checked the family correspondence files. No Eleanor. He checked the property tax records. No Eleanor. He checked the parish marriage and death registers. No Eleanor. The name appeared nowhere except in those monthly withdrawals, month after month, year after year, a ghost made of ink and arithmetic. When Thomas asked Margaret about Eleanor B., she paused for perhaps 3 seconds before answering. That was the detail he later remembered. The pause. She said that Eleanor had been a governess, employed by the family many years earlier, and that the payments were a small pension arranged by Silas. When Thomas asked why a governess's pension was being paid from the household accounts rather than the estate accounts, Margaret said she did not know. She had never concerned herself with the details of bookkeeping. When Thomas asked Edmund the same question the following day, Edmund gave a different answer. He said Eleanor B. was a supplier from Baton Rouge, a woman who provided specialized goods for the mill. Thomas pointed out that the mill had its own accounts and that the payments appeared in the household ledger, not the mill ledger. Edmund stared at him for a long moment and said that the accounting system had been Silas's creation and that Silas had had his reasons. Edmund was not a man who invited follow-up questions. When Thomas asked Nathaniel, the two men were alone in the record room. Nathaniel was shorter than Edmund, thinner, with quick eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating something. He did not pause when Thomas mentioned Eleanor B. He said immediately and smoothly that Eleanor B was an abbreviation. The initials stood for eleemosynary beneficiary, he explained, a term Silas had used for anonymous charitable donations. The payments were alms distributed to the poor of the parish. Silas had been a private man and had not wanted his charitable activities publicized. Thomas had many questions about this explanation, but he did not voice them. He had already seen enough to know that the family was not telling him the truth. An eleemosynary beneficiary did not receive payments of exactly the same range every month for 18 years. Alms varied. These payments did not. Moreover, if the payments were charitable donations, they should have been recorded in the estate's charitable giving ledger, a separate volume that Thomas had already located and reviewed. That ledger showed regular donations to the church and a few local charities. None of them matched the Eleanor B. withdrawals. Thomas decided on the evening of the 8th of October to expand his investigation beyond the ledgers. The family had given him access to the record room, but he had noticed on his first day a smaller storage closet at the back of the house near the kitchen. He had been told it contained old papers of no importance. On the night of the 8th, long after the household had retired, Thomas took a candle and made his way to that closet. The door was not locked. Inside, he found wooden crates filled with correspondence, receipts, and legal documents, apparently discarded but not yet disposed of. The papers dated mostly from the 1840s and early 1850s. Thomas spent 3 hours sorting through them by candlelight, and his efforts were rewarded shortly before dawn. In a crate marked Correspondence, 1841 to 1845, he found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. There were 12 letters in total. They were all addressed to Silas Blackwood. They were all signed by the same person. The signature read, Eleanor Blackwood. The letters were not threatening. They were not dramatic. They were not the ravings of a mad woman or the pleas of a prisoner. They were formal, composed, and heartbreakingly patient. The first, dated March 3, 1841, introduced the writer as Silas's sister and reminded him that their father, Isaac Blackwood, had died in January of that year. The letter requested information about the settlement of the estate. The second, dated May 12, 1841, asked why Eleanor had not been contacted about the probate proceedings. The third, dated August 19, 1841, expressed confusion about a document Eleanor had received, a document that appeared to show her renouncing all claims to the family property. She had not signed such a document, she wrote. She had not agreed to any renunciation. She demanded an explanation. The remaining 9 letters, spanning the years 1842 to 1858, followed a similar pattern. Some were formal legal requests, some were personal appeals, some were brief and businesslike, asking for updates on specific matters. All of them asked the same fundamental question. Why was Eleanor Blackwood being denied what was rightfully hers? None of them had received a response. Thomas found no copies of replies anywhere in the crate or in the main correspondence files. Thomas was not a lawyer. He was an accountant, but he understood what he was looking at. If Eleanor Blackwood was a real person, if she was Silas's sister and Isaac Blackwood's daughter, then she was entitled to a share of the family estate. The document that purported to show her renunciation might be fraudulent, and the monthly payments to Eleanor B. were not a governess's pension or a supplier's invoice or charitable alms. They were the cost of keeping Eleanor Blackwood hidden. On the morning of the 9th of October, Thomas rode into convent and visited the parish courthouse. He requested access to the succession records for Isaac Blackwood. He filed in 1841. The records confirmed what the letters suggested. Isaac Blackwood had died on January 19, 1841. He had been survived by 3 children: Silas, born in 1799, Edmund, born in 1807, and Eleanor, born in 1811. Under Louisiana law, which followed the Napoleonic Code rather than English common law, all 3 children were entitled to equal shares of their father's estate, subject to certain conditions. The succession file contained a document dated July 22, 1841, in which Eleanor Blackwood renounced her inheritance due to a chronic condition of health requiring her permanent removal from the state of Louisiana. The document was witnessed by 2 men, Edmund Blackwood and a notary public from Ascension Parish whose name Thomas did not recognize. The signature looked to Thomas's untrained eye consistent with the signatures on the letters, but he was not a handwriting expert, and he could not be certain. What he could be certain of was the contradiction. If Eleanor had permanently left Louisiana in 1841, why were payments being made to her every month from the Blackwood household accounts? Why were those payments still being made in October of 1859, 18 years after her supposed departure? And why, if she had voluntarily renounced her inheritance, had she spent nearly 2 decades writing letters demanding her rights? Thomas returned to the Blackwood property that afternoon and confronted Margaret directly. He did not tell her about the letters. He simply asked again about Eleanor. This time he used the full name, Eleanor Blackwood. Margaret's face changed. She sat down slowly in the nearest chair. After a long silence, she said that she had not known the truth until 1856. She had believed, like everyone else, that Eleanor had left Louisiana voluntarily. It was only when she found a letter from Eleanor hidden in Silas's desk that she began to understand. She had confronted her husband. Silas had told her that Eleanor was mentally unstable, that the isolation was for her own protection, that doctors had recommended it. Margaret had wanted to believe him. She had needed to believe him. She was a woman with no independent income, no children, and no other family. If the Blackwood estate collapsed, she would be left with nothing. Thomas asked what Silas had told her about the North House. Margaret looked at him with genuine surprise. She did not know what he was talking about. She had never heard of the North House. That was the moment when Thomas realized that the concealment of Eleanor Blackwood was not a single conspiracy orchestrated by the family as a unit. It was a layered deception, with different members of the family knowing different pieces of the truth. Margaret knew that Eleanor existed and that she had been isolated. She did not know where Eleanor was. Edmund and Nathaniel, Thomas suspected, knew much more. The North House, the name that Arthur Blanchard had found in the inventory, the building that appeared on no map, the location where maintenance costs, food, clothing, and the wages of 2 employees had been directed for 18 years. Thomas could not find the North House by asking the family. He needed someone who knew the land. He found that person 3 days later in the town of Donaldsonville on the opposite bank of the Mississippi. His name was Claude Fournier, and he was 73 years old. For most of his adult life, Claude had worked as a surveyor for the parish government, mapping property boundaries, resolving land disputes, and maintaining the official cadastral records. He had retired in 1852, but his memory of the region's geography was encyclopedic. Claude Fournier received Thomas in a small cottage near the river, surrounded by stacks of old maps and survey notebooks. When Thomas mentioned the Blackwood property, Claude's expression grew thoughtful. He said he had surveyed that land twice, once in 1835, when Isaac Blackwood had purchased an adjacent parcel from a neighbour, and again in 1837, when a minor boundary dispute had arisen with a property to the north. Claude's survey notebooks from those years were still in his possession, and he agreed to let Thomas examine them. The notebook from 1837 contained a hand-drawn map of the entire Blackwood estate. The map showed the main house, the sugar mill, the slave quarters, the barns, the dock, and the various fields, all arranged along the curve of the Mississippi. But there was something else. Near the northern boundary of the property, approximately 1.25 miles from the main house, the map showed a small structure marked with the notation residence, small frame construction, 2 rooms. The structure was situated at the end of a narrow track that branched off from the main road leading north. Around it, Claude had drawn a cluster of cypress trees and a small pond. Thomas asked Claude if he remembered this structure. Claude said he did. He had spoken to a woman there during his 1837 survey. She had been young, perhaps in her mid-20s, and she had asked him what he was doing on the property. He had explained about the boundary dispute, and she had nodded and gone back inside. He had assumed she was a relative of the family, perhaps a cousin or a young aunt. He had never seen her again. Thomas asked if Claude could show him the location on a current map. Claude took out a more recent survey, completed in 1855 by a different surveyor. The structure was gone from the map. The track leading to it was gone. The notation was gone. Where the North House had been, the 1855 map showed only undeveloped woodland. Someone had erased it. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1859, Thomas Hale set out on foot from the Blackwood main house, heading north. He carried Claude Fournier's 1837 map, a compass, and a canteen of water. He told no one where he was going. The weather that morning was characteristic of Louisiana in October, warm, humid, and overcast, with a heavy sky that threatened rain but never delivered it. Thomas walked along the main road for perhaps half a mile, past fields where sugarcane stood in dense rows, past the sugar mill with its tall chimney and the smell of boiling molasses, past the slave quarters, a double row of whitewashed cabins set back from the road, and then into an area where the cultivated land gave way to wild growth. At the point marked on Claude's map as the beginning of the track, Thomas found nothing that looked like a path. The undergrowth was thick, palmettos, brambles, and young cypress trees that had grown up over the years. But when he pushed through the first layer of vegetation, he found beneath it the remnants of an old roadbed. The ground was harder there, packed down by years of use, and the alignment was straight enough to suggest deliberate construction. He followed the old track for nearly an hour. The cypress trees grew thicker as he went, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the light. The air grew cooler and damper. He crossed a small creek on a bridge of rotting planks, then climbed a low rise, and then, quite suddenly, he saw it. The North House was a small frame building, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, constructed in the simple Creole cottage style common to rural Louisiana. It had a steep, pitched roof of wooden shingles, a narrow front porch, and 2 shuttered windows facing south toward the main house. The whitewash had peeled away in patches, revealing grey, weathered cypress beneath. A brick chimney rose from the north side of the roof, and a thin ribbon of smoke drifted from it. The house was surrounded by a small clearing, perhaps half an acre, that had been maintained with obvious care. There was a vegetable garden on the east side, a chicken coop, a cistern for collecting rainwater, and a clothesline strung between 2 posts. 2 wooden chairs sat on the porch. One of them was occupied. The woman in the chair was perhaps 48 years old. She had dark hair streaked with grey, pulled back simply, and she wore a plain cotton dress of faded blue. She was reading a book. Thomas later noted that it was a collection of essays by an English writer whose name he did not catch, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps. Her expression was not fearful. It was not surprised. It was, if anything, wearily curious, as if she had been expecting a visitor for many years and had finally stopped believing one would come. Thomas introduced himself. He said his name and explained that he was an accountant reviewing the Blackwood estate. He did not say more than that because he was not certain what he was allowed to say. The woman closed her book. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I am Eleanor Blackwood, and I have been waiting for someone like you for 18 years. What followed was not a confession or a dramatic revelation. It was a conversation, conducted on the porch of the North House over the course of the next several hours, during which Eleanor Blackwood told Thomas Hale the story of her life. She had been born in 1811, the youngest of Isaac Blackwood's 3 children, and the only daughter. Her mother had died when she was 4 years old, and she had been raised primarily by servants and by a series of governesses. Her relationship with her brothers had never been close. Silas, 12 years her senior, had treated her with a distant, formal politeness that felt more like obligation than affection. Edmund, 4 years older, had resented the attention she received from their father. Isaac Blackwood, by all accounts, had loved his daughter deeply, and he had made it clear in conversations that Eleanor later remembered that he intended for her to inherit an equal share of the family property. When Isaac died in January of 1841, Eleanor was 29 years old. She was unmarried. She had no independent income. She lived in the main house with her brothers, and she had assumed, based on her father's assurances, that she would receive her inheritance and be free to make her own choices. That was not what happened. In the weeks following Isaac's death, Silas and Edmund told Eleanor that there were complications with the estate. Certain debts had to be settled, certain legal documents had to be prepared. She would need to be patient. Then, in March of 1841, they told her that a doctor from New Orleans had recommended, based on a written evaluation of her mental state, that she be moved to a quieter location for her own well-being. Eleanor protested. She demanded to see the evaluation. She demanded to speak to the doctor. Her brothers told her that the evaluation was confidential, that the doctor had already returned to New Orleans, and that the move was in her best interest. When she refused to cooperate, they told her something else. There were court orders, they said. Legal documents that authorized her removal and confinement. If she resisted, she would be taken to an asylum in Baton Rouge, where conditions were far worse than anything she could imagine. Eleanor was not physically restrained. She was not locked in a room. She was not beaten or starved or threatened with violence. What happened to her was more subtle and, in its way, more complete. Her brothers convinced her that she had no legal rights, no recourse, and no way to escape. They controlled the mail, reading every letter she wrote and discarding the ones addressed to lawyers or authorities. They controlled who could visit her, and almost no one did. They controlled the information she received, telling her that certain legal proceedings were underway, that certain appeals had been filed, that she simply needed to wait. And she waited. She waited for years. The North House, where she had been moved in February of 1841, was comfortable enough. She had 2 rooms, a fireplace, books, and eventually a garden. 2 servants, a married couple named Joseph and Celeste, were assigned to attend to her needs. They were not jailers. They were kind people who had been told that Miss Eleanor suffered from a nervous condition that required seclusion and rest. They brought her food, washed her clothes, and kept the house in repair. They never questioned the arrangement because there was no reason to question it. The Blackwoods were respectable people. Silas Blackwood was a church-going man. Why would anyone doubt his word? The letters that Thomas had found in the storage closet were only a fragment of the correspondence Eleanor had written over the years. She had written dozens more, to judges, lawyers, newspapers, and distant relatives. She had written to the governor of Louisiana. She had written to a cousin in South Carolina who had once been kind to her as a child. She had written to the bishop of the diocese. All of these letters had been given to Joseph, who was instructed to deliver them to the main house for posting. None of them had ever been sent. They had been collected by Silas or Edmund, read, and then stored in boxes that accumulated in the attics and closets of the Blackwood property. Eleanor had suspected this, but she had no way to prove it and no alternative means of communication. The North House was 1.25 miles from the main road, hidden behind cypress trees. No one passed by, no one visited. She had been, for all practical purposes, erased. The worst part, Eleanor told Thomas, was not the isolation itself. It was the uncertainty. Every year, Silas or Edmund would visit, brief, formal visits, never lasting more than an hour. And they would tell her that her case was being reviewed, that progress was being made, that she simply needed to be patient a little longer. She had believed them at first. By the late 1840s, she had stopped believing. By the 1850s, she had stopped hoping. She lived her life in the North House, tending her garden, reading her books, and waiting for something that she had finally accepted might never come. When Silas Blackwood died in July of 1859, Eleanor did not know. No one told her. The servants, Joseph and Celeste, heard the news from the main house, but were instructed not to mention it. The payments continued, the food continued, the isolation continued. Eleanor Blackwood, the rightful heir to a substantial portion of one of the largest estates in St. James Parish, had outlived her jailer without knowing it. Thomas Hale listened to all of this on the porch of the North House. He took no notes because he did not need to. Every detail of the conversation would remain with him for the rest of his life. When Eleanor finished her account, Thomas asked a question that had been forming in his mind throughout her narrative. He asked whether she had signed the document in 1841, the document that purported to show her renouncing her inheritance. Eleanor's expression did not change. She said that she had signed a document, yes, but the document she had signed was not a renunciation. It was a power of attorney, presented to her by Silas and a notary, authorizing Silas to manage her financial affairs during her illness. She had signed it because she had been told it was necessary for the payment of her expenses. She had not read it carefully because the notary, a nervous young man from Donaldsonville, had assured her it was a standard form. She realized years later that the document must have been altered or replaced, that the power of attorney had been switched for a renunciation, or that additional pages had been added after her signature. She had no way to prove this. She had no copy of what she signed. She had only her memory, and her memory, she had been told repeatedly, was unreliable. Thomas considered the implications. If Eleanor's account was true, and he believed it was, then the foundation of the Blackwood family's financial arrangements for the past 18 years was fraudulent. The lands that Silas and Edmund had used as collateral for loans, the lands they had sold or leased, the lands they had passed off as their own, a significant portion of those lands belonged legally to Eleanor. If she contested the renunciation in court, every transaction based on that document could be challenged. Every creditor who had accepted Blackwood land as security could find their claims contested. The financial consequences would be enormous. But there was another implication, one that Thomas found even more disturbing. If Eleanor had been alive and living on the Blackwood property for the past 18 years, then the document claiming she had permanently left Louisiana was demonstrably false. The family had not just stolen her inheritance. They had fabricated a legal paper trail to justify the theft. And they had done it so effectively that no one, not the parish authorities, not the creditors, not the neighbours, had questioned the story for nearly 2 decades. The North House, Thomas realised, was not just a place. It was the proof. Its existence, its maintenance, its expenses, its 2 employees, its location, was a physical record of a crime. And that was why the family had been so desperate to remove the references to it from the inventory. That was why Edmund and Nathaniel had taken the pages from the parish record office. That was why they had told Arthur Blanchard it was a simple accounting correction. If the North House appeared in the official inventory of Silas Blackwood's estate, any competent lawyer could trace the expenses back to Eleanor. The whole structure of deceit would collapse. Thomas returned to the main house late that afternoon. He said nothing about his visit to the North House. He spent the next several days working in the record room, compiling copies of every document that might be relevant. The ledgers showing the monthly payments to Eleanor B., the correspondence files, the succession records for Isaac Blackwood, the document purporting to show Eleanor's renunciation, and the 1837 map that showed the North House. He made duplicates of everything and hid the duplicates in the lining of his satchel. He worked carefully and quietly, aware that he was being watched. On the morning of the 19th of October, Thomas told Margaret Blackwood that he had completed his preliminary review and needed to return to New Orleans to report to the creditors. He would be back, he said, within a week or 2. He did not tell her what he had found. That evening, as Thomas was packing his belongings in his room, Nathaniel Blackwood appeared at his door. Nathaniel's manner was different from before, less polished, more direct. He asked Thomas what he intended to tell the creditors. Thomas replied that he would present his findings accurately, as he had been hired to do. Nathaniel asked what those findings were. Thomas said that the creditors would receive a full report in due course. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said very quietly that the Blackwood family had survived wars, epidemics, floods, and market crashes. They had survived because they understood that some things were more important than money. Reputation, for example, continuity, family. He said that Silas had been a complicated man who had made difficult decisions to protect the family's interests. He said that Eleanor was a troubled woman who had never been capable of managing her own affairs. He said that the arrangement, imperfect as it might have been, had served everyone's interests for 18 years, and he said that it would be a shame if an outsider, someone with no connection to the family, no understanding of its history, were to disrupt that arrangement based on incomplete information. Thomas said he understood. He did not say that he agreed. Nathaniel left. Thomas departed the Blackwood property the following morning, the 20th of October, 1859. He travelled by carriage to the river landing, then by ferry across the Mississippi, then by another carriage to New Orleans. He arrived in the city on the evening of the 21st and went directly to the offices of the creditor consortium. He spent the next 2 days preparing his report. The report was 23 pages long. It documented the monthly payments to Eleanor B. It documented the contradictory explanations offered by the Blackwood family. It documented the letters from Eleanor Blackwood. It documented the succession records for Isaac Blackwood. It documented the 1837 map showing the North House. It documented Thomas's visit to the North House and his conversation with Eleanor. It concluded, in clear and unambiguous language, that Eleanor Blackwood was alive, that she had been falsely isolated on the Blackwood property for 18 years, that the document purporting to show her renunciation of her inheritance was almost certainly fraudulent, and that the Blackwood family had engaged in a systematic scheme to deny her legal rights for the purpose of maintaining control over the family estate. The creditors received the report on the 24th of October. They were, by all accounts, alarmed, not primarily by the moral dimensions of the case, but by its financial implications. If Eleanor Blackwood successfully contested the renunciation, she could claim a substantial portion of the lands that had been used as collateral for the Blackwood loans. The creditors' security would be compromised. The loans might become uncollectible. The financial exposure was potentially catastrophic. The creditors acted quickly. On the 26th of October, their attorneys filed a petition in the District Court of Orleans Parish, requesting that the succession of Isaac Blackwood be reopened, that the 1841 renunciation be examined, and that Eleanor Blackwood be recognized as an heir with full legal rights. The petition included excerpts from Thomas Hale's report and requested that the court issue an order preserving all relevant documents. The petition was granted. Word reached St. James Parish within days. What happened next is documented in fragmentary records that survive in the parish archives. On the 30th of October, Edmund Blackwood and Nathaniel Blackwood appeared at the St. James Parish Courthouse and requested access to the succession records for Isaac Blackwood. They were told that the records had been sealed by court order. They left without further comment. That same night, a fire was reported at the Blackwood main house. The fire was confined to the record room on the ground floor. The iron safe survived, but most of the ledgers, correspondence files, and loose documents stored on the shelves were destroyed. The cause of the fire was never determined. The parish fire marshal's report, dated November 2nd, 1859, noted that the damage was consistent with an oil lamp that had been knocked over, perhaps by the wind. The report did not speculate further, but the documents that mattered had already been copied. Thomas Hale's duplicates, hidden in the lining of his satchel and now in the possession of the creditor's attorneys, included the most important records. The financial ledgers showing the payments to Eleanor B., the letters from Eleanor to Silas, the 1837 map. None of these had been in the record room when the fire occurred. They were safe in New Orleans. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and protracted. Eleanor Blackwood, now represented by attorneys hired by the creditor consortium, filed a formal challenge to the 1841 renunciation in November of 1859. The challenge alleged that the renunciation had been obtained through fraud, that Eleanor had not been mentally incapacitated at the time she signed the relevant documents, and that the Blackwood family had concealed her existence for the purpose of depriving her of her inheritance. The case was assigned to Judge Robert Thibodeau of the District Court. The surviving court records show that Edmund and Nathaniel Blackwood, through their own attorneys, denied all allegations. They argued that Eleanor had indeed renounced her inheritance voluntarily, that she had indeed left Louisiana in 1841, and that the woman living in the North House was not Eleanor Blackwood, but an unrelated individual whom Silas had supported out of charity. This argument collapsed when Eleanor appeared in person at a preliminary hearing on the 9th of January, 1860, and was positively identified by 3 independent witnesses who had known her as a young woman. The case never reached a final judgment on all issues. In February of 1860, with the legal pressure mounting and the creditors threatening immediate foreclosure, the Blackwood family began selling off parcels of land. The first sale, recorded on the 18th of February, transferred 200 acres of riverfront property to a planter from Ascension Parish. The second sale, on the 3rd of March, transferred an additional 300 acres to a consortium of investors from New Orleans. By the end of 1860, the Blackwood estate had been reduced to less than half its original size. Eleanor Blackwood received a portion of the proceeds from these sales, not the full amount she was owed, according to later assessments, but enough to secure her independence. In April of 1860, she left the North House and moved to a small residence in New Orleans, where she lived quietly for the remainder of her life. She never married. She never forgave her family. In a letter written to a friend in 1862, she described the 18 years she had spent in the North House as a slow death from which I am only now beginning to recover. Edmund Blackwood died in 1863 at the age of 56 of a heart condition that had troubled him for years. Nathaniel Blackwood left Louisiana in 1861, relocating first to Texas and then, after the war, to California. He died in San Francisco in 1878, leaving behind a modest estate and no descendants. Margaret Blackwood remained in the main house until her death in 1867, outliving her husband's family but not its legacy. The Blackwood property, or what remained of it, was sold at auction in 1865. The main house changed hands several times over the following decades. The North House, abandoned after Eleanor's departure, fell into disrepair and eventually collapsed. By the early 20th century, the only trace of it was a scatter of bricks in the undergrowth, visible only in winter when the vegetation died back. And there, for many years, the story ended. The Blackwood case became a minor footnote in the legal history of Louisiana succession law, mentioned occasionally in law review articles about fraudulent renunciations and undue influence. The family faded from public memory. The documents gathered dust. The discovery that brought the story back to light occurred in 1963, more than a century after the events themselves. A graduate student in history at Louisiana State University, researching 19th-century plantation records for her dissertation, was examining documents in the basement archives of the St. James Parish Courthouse. The archives had been poorly organized for decades, and many of the older records had been boxed and stored in no particular order. In a box labeled Succession Records, Miscellaneous, 1858 to 1860, the student found a folder that did not belong. The folder contained the original 31 pages of Silas Blackwood's estate inventory, the same pages that Edmund and Nathaniel Blackwood had taken from Arthur Blanchard's office on the 8th of September, 1859. How the pages had ended up in the courthouse archives was unclear. Perhaps they had been seized during the legal proceedings. Perhaps they had been surrendered voluntarily. Perhaps they had simply been misplaced. The folder had no index number and no file notation. It had apparently been sitting in that box, unnoticed and unexamined, for over 100 years. The student recognized the significance of the find immediately. She had been studying the Blackwood case for several months and was familiar with the general outline of events. But the inventory itself, the complete original document, had been thought lost. She opened the folder carefully, aware that the paper would be fragile, and began to read. The inventory was exactly as Arthur Blanchard had remembered it. 31 pages of listings, land parcels, farming equipment, livestock, household goods, debts, credits, and scattered throughout the references to the North House, the maintenance payments, the food and clothing, the wages of the 2 employees, all of it. But there was something else, something Arthur Blanchard had never mentioned because he had never seen it. On the margin of the page where the North House first appeared, someone had written a single line in pencil. The handwriting was small and neat, the sort of script used by a person accustomed to writing quickly and discreetly. It read, "Remove before registration." Beneath the instruction, also in pencil, was a date, October 1st, 1859. October 1st, 1859. That was 3 days before Thomas Hale began his review of the Blackwood accounts. 3 days before the accountant from New Orleans opened the ledgers and noticed the monthly payments to Eleanor B. 3 days before the investigation that would unravel 18 years of lies. The meaning of the notation was clear. Someone in the Blackwood family, the handwriting was later identified, tentatively, as Nathaniel's, had reviewed the inventory before it was submitted to the parish record office. That person had recognized the danger posed by the references to the North House. That person had written an instruction to remove those references before the document became part of the public record. And then, for reasons the surviving documents do not explain, the instruction had not been followed. The pages had been submitted as they were. Arthur Blanchard had read them, and the secret that the Blackwood family had kept for 18 years had begun its slow, inexorable journey toward the light. If the clerk had accepted the request to replace the pages, the graduate student wrote in a paper published the following year, the North House would have vanished from the official record. There would have been no documentary evidence linking the monthly payments to a physical location. There would have been no proof that Eleanor Blackwood had remained in Louisiana after 1841. The family's story, that Eleanor had left the state voluntarily, that she had renounced her inheritance, that she was not part of the Blackwood legacy, would have remained intact, supported by documents that no one had reason to question. Eleanor herself, isolated and voiceless, would have had no way to challenge those documents. The truth would have remained buried not under the ground, but under paper. The graduate student's paper attracted little attention when it was published. The Blackwood case was a century old. The family was extinct. The lands had been subdivided and sold and subdivided again. The North House was a scatter of bricks in the woods. There were no living relatives to contact, no pending legal claims to resolve, no practical consequences to consider. The story was simply a story. But the paper did one thing that mattered. It preserved the narrative of what had happened on the Blackwood property between 1841 and 1859, based on documents that had very nearly been destroyed. It recorded the names: Silas, who had designed the scheme; Edmund, who had enforced it; Nathaniel, who had falsified the records; Margaret, who had discovered the truth and chosen silence; and Eleanor, who had survived. The North House is gone now. The main house, restored by a preservation society in the 1990s, is open to visitors on weekends. The tour guides mention the Blackwood family briefly, their role in the sugar industry, their contributions to the parish, their prominence in antebellum Louisiana society. They do not mention Eleanor. They do not mention the 18 years. They do not mention the notation in the margin of the inventory. The story, like the house itself, has been tidied up and made presentable. But the records remain. They are stored in the state archives in Baton Rouge, in climate-controlled rooms accessible to researchers. The inventory is there, in its original folder, the pencil notation still legible after more than a century. The ledgers are there, showing the monthly payments to Eleanor B. Month after month, year after year, a rhythm of concealment maintained with the precision of a clock. The letters are there, the 12 letters tied with blue ribbon, Eleanor's patient and unanswered demands for justice. The succession records are there, the fraudulent renunciations still filed among the legitimate documents, indistinguishable at a glance from any other legal paper. And somewhere in the archives, in a box that has not been opened in decades, there is a map of the Blackwood property drawn in 1837. It shows the main house, the sugar mill, the fields, the river. And in the top corner, nearly at the edge of the page, a small square marked with the words, Residence. Small, frame construction, 2 rooms, the North House. Still there, after all this time, waiting for someone to notice.